All right, everybody, let's get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Lunchtime Discovery Series. I'm your host, Chris Smith, and I work at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. It's good to be with everybody this Wednesday for another edition of our Lunchtime Discovery Series. This program is brought to you every week by the folks at the Office of Environmental Education within the Department of Environmental Quality and broadcast to you and hosted by us here at the Museum of Natural Sciences. A great partnership to bring science, nature, education, art, all things great to you every Wednesday at noon right here at the museum's Facebook channel. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to the museum's YouTube channel. That way, if you like presentations like this, learning new things, we all do, right? Then you can get that notification to come and join us every week at noon. You can also visit the website for the Office of Environmental Education. That's eenorthcarolina.org. There you can actually sign up for the email newsletter for the Lunchtime Discovery Series. That way you'll get the e-news update, see what talks are coming up, bookmark your favorites, put them on the calendar, and come and join us here every week because we learn something new, yes, but the great part about this program, even doing it virtually via live stream like this, is that you still have the opportunity to interact with our guest speakers and ask your questions. So don't forget, as we go throughout the program today, jump in the chat over on the side. Let us know where you're watching from, but also as we go through the program, leave your questions, your thoughts, and comments about the topic in the chat. When we get to the end of the presentation, I'll actually be looking to see what you folks are interested in and pose your questions to our guest speaker. So get active in the chat. I want to see lots of questions popping up as we get towards the end of the program for sure. Now, today we do have a great program for you. For folks who've been tuning in to the Lunchtime Discovery Series for a little while, you know that more and more we've been bringing in guest speakers who can focus on topics centered around the idea of environmental justice. And today we're going to be doing a little bit of that work as well. Today's guest is Rob McDonald, Dr. Rob McDonald from the Nature Conservancy. He's the lead scientist for nature-based solutions there. Rob, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for everyone for being here. This is a pleasure. I grew up in North Carolina, so it's just close to my heart to do this talk. I'm going to try to share my screen now. I'm calling in today from Europe, from Switzerland. So I've been told it takes a while for my images to show up there. So hopefully this all works. Chris, can you nod when you see that title slide?
Looks great.
So my talk today is about tree inequality and tree cover, something we all take for granted in our cities sometimes, but something that provides lots of benefits and benefits that aren't necessarily always provided fairly or justly between different neighborhoods. So before I get into cities and trees, I wanted to give you a picture of a place close to my heart and a place that's maybe more what people usually think of when they think of the Nature Conservancy or conservationists. This is the Green Swamp in North Carolina, and this is where I sort of fell in love with nature, or systems like this, right? So very diverse longleaf pine savanna. It's a cool system because on the ground you have Venus flytraps, one of the few places you see that. So conservationists, of course, think about natural places like this and preserving them. And sometimes conservationists think about preserving land from cities. So I just switched over to a picture here of San Francisco in the distance, and this is the Golden Gate Recreation Area. So this is a landscape where the Nature Conservancy worked with some ranchers who were going out of business actually to protect this land, which otherwise would have been residential homes, and turn it into a national park. So that's this mode of protecting nature from cities, and that is part of what we do with the Nature Conservancy, and it's important, right? You want to protect some of the last great places, some of the biodiverse natural areas out there. But there's another really important mode of thinking about cities, which is what do we need from nature in the urban world we live in? So this picture always blows my mind. This is the Earth at night from space. And this is what our world looks like at night. So you can see really dramatically all of our cities radiating light out into space. And you can see North Carolina on the right there. So we are now a majority urban species. Most of humanity lives in cities. In the US, about 80% of us live in cities. And the next few decades, actually, globally, are the fastest period of urban growth in human history. There will be 2 billion or so more urban dwellers by 2050. So to get your head around how big a number that is, if you think of a city, see if I can do the math right, around the size of Raleigh, think about all the roads and bridges and houses. We are sort of building as a species a city that size every week or so, roughly. That's the pace of urban growth every single week out to 2050. The estimates are that by the time we're finished with all this city building in 2050, if you were to push all that new urban area together, it would cover the size of the state of Texas. So it's a huge urban footprint. And so for the conservation movement, how that urban area is shaped matters a lot, right? And I'm going to show you just a few slides with some data on the population growth in cities. So this is the world in 1950. The size of the circle here is the number of people. So we had 101 million folks living in cities in 1950. The color here is the proportion of folks that lived in cities. So you can sort of see as I click through over time, and I'm sure there's a bit of lag as this loads for everyone. Here's 1970. The US is up to 154 million folks in cities. This is 2010, so fairly recently. So 255 million people in the US out of, I forget what the US is in total, 300 something million folks. And you can see this really expansive fast growth, especially in China and India. So while most of that urban growth picture is in Asia, in places like Hong Kong, you can see this really dramatic picture of Hong Kong here, it is happening in the US as well. And in the US and Europe, it's especially, urban growth is especially a big issue because we tend to grow our cities at fairly low density, fairly car-dependent way of growing, and that has implications for things like greenhouse gas emissions. So 80% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions comes from cities. 80% of the world's energy, the world's use of timber comes from cities. And we're spending a lot as a species building new cities, about $5 trillion a year, every year out to 2030 in this case. So there's both a huge challenge for conservationists in structuring those cities so they're sustainable, but also something that's an exciting opportunity because we do have a chance to design more efficient cities. So there's a huge outgrowth now of smart cities, ways that cities can use energy more efficiently, and ways that cities can use nature more efficiently. So that's kind of the focus of my talk. Because as an environmentalist, as a conservationist, I don't want our cities to look a lot like this. This is the Los Angeles River. Many people have seen an image like this in the Terminator movies, right, where Arnold Schwarzenegger is driving down the LA River. It is sort of the iconic place that lost all of its ecological value. And in fact, for a long time in planning documents in Los Angeles, this was called the LA Stormwater Conveyance System. So it stopped even being called a river. So you see cities, though, trying to take a different approach and think about how nature can fit into their cities. And I wanted to give you an example that's from far away geographically, but I find it really interesting. So this is Seoul, Korea. And this is a picture from the 1950s, very typical 1950s development, very car-centered. You can see the highway going down the middle. And that highway is actually on top of a river. So this was even more of an artificial system than the Los Angeles River, totally channelized, and they had a highway on top. And this is what that river looks like today. So I'll pause and let that load up for folks. You can see the huge amount of greenery that's back in this river. You're starting to get wild fish species back in this river. This is still the stormwater conveyance system for Seoul. So in big rain events, the stormwater still moves out through this site, and people can't walk here. But it's also a public park. This is where people go to recreate and relax. So what's exciting for me, I did my PhD there at Duke. I was trained to protect nature from people, but more and more in my job, I'm getting asked to think about what can nature do for people in cities? How can we have spaces like this in our cities that make our lives better? And so that's really the theme of the Nature Conservancy's work in cities. We're trying to understand how you can strengthen the connection between people and the natural world so that both of them can thrive, right? We have to get cities right so that we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we're using resources sustainably, we're not wrecking natural areas, but we also need nature for people. And I'm going to switch into that mode of conservation for people for the rest of my talk and give you first a quick tour of maybe the main kinds of benefits of nature, and then I'm going to jump into trees, which have a especially important role for all of our well-being in cities. So first of all, we just focus on planning, metro area planning for park systems. So this is Melbourne, Australia. This is a place where we coordinated an urban forestry plan for all of the different metro areas in Melbourne. There's close to 50 of them. So that's an important theme of certainly US cities as well. We engage with a lot of US cities when they're thinking about comprehensive plans and how are you going to have park systems for people, and how are you going to have trees that make those more friendly places to be. There's a huge focus in the US now on stormwater management, and I know from some colleagues at Duke and in Durham that it's a huge issue in Durham, right? Thinking about Jordan Lake. So in many US cities, you also see spaces like this one. This is in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where this is actually a garden, but it's also managing stormwater. So when there's big storm events, this place floods. And instead of that rainwater then rushing into the stormwater system, sewage system, maybe causing the sewage system to overflow and pollute waterways, that stormwater is being infiltrated into the ground and it's being managed more safely. So you can see the theme here of kind of getting multiple benefits from a natural area within the city. So another big theme is heat and heat management. We felt a lot of this, well, in the US and in Europe now where I live, in Southern Europe, it was really, really hot as well. As climate change is ramping up, cities are struggling more with how you keep people cool. I'm going to return to this actually multiple times in my talk, but here's an example from Phoenix, Arizona, of a community planting that is trying to make a park just a place that's nice to go, that's inhabitable on a really hot day. So again, this is a focus, a way that cities are asking for nature to benefit people. There's also interesting work in the US around the way trees help clean our air. So people don't always think about this, but trees help reduce particulate matter pollution in the air. So particulate matter, when you burn fossil fuels, like from your car, it puts small particles up in the air. And when you breathe that in, that's very bad for your health. Trees and their leaves are a place for those particles to settle out on. So just like you have dust that settles out in your house and that it reduces the dust floating around, basically trees are a surface that sequesters particulate matter. So I showed you a picture of Louisville, Kentucky. We have an interesting project with the Natural Institutes of Health trying to understand, do neighborhoods with more tree cover have better health outcomes in terms of air quality and cardiovascular health? All right, so this is kind of the last part of my general tour of the kinds of benefits nature provides. Another important benefit is just connecting people with nature. We have a number of these programs. This is an example from Massachusetts, where there are students, high school students in this case, they're both helping collect data on one of our preserves, helping us manage it better, but this is also giving them a summer internship, a job experience, and also for many of them, their first experience working outside for prolonged periods of time and sort of connecting with nature. So that too is one of the benefits of nature in cities. And I just thought I'd throw this in. This slide is now a little dated. Things changed during the COVID period, but it gives you a sense of the breadth of the kinds of things we work on. Okay, so I will jump into more of the science piece and some of the fun stuff I do at the Nature Conservancy as a scientist who focuses on nature-based solutions. So that is just the benefits nature provides to people. And this side is trying to communicate to you all of the different ways that trees can help. So I mentioned some of these already, managing stormwater, but I mentioned particulate matter pollution, but trees also help reduce stress. So there's a lot of evidence that people in hospitals with a view out on trees, for instance, heal faster. They have less cortisol, they recover from surgery better. So when we work with cities to plan for urban trees, we encourage them to think about this whole stack of benefits and to plan for them. All right, but there's a catch with that sort of happy picture of all the benefits trees provide. And so you can start to see the catch, the challenge in this picture. So for many, many years, more than a decade, I lived in Washington, D.C., where the Nature Conservancy is headquartered. And I still think of it in some ways as my home. So I wanted to show you just visually what tree inequality looks like. So the top right picture here is a low-income neighborhood in Washington, D.C. This is renter-occupied. You can see the rental management company just has a lawn there. The bottom picture are buildings built in the same post-World War II period, same brick, 3-story kind of construction. This is an owner-occupied unit, and you can see the really dense tree canopy that's grown up. So when you multiply differences like that across a whole city, a whole metro region, you get differences in tree cover like what we're showing here. So I'm going to talk throughout the rest of my slides about poor households and rich households, and I'm usually talking about the poorest quartile, so that's the poorest 25% of households. In the case of Washington, D.C., there's 35% forest cover in those households, in their neighborhoods. And then I'm going to talk about the richest quartile. So the richest 25% of households, there's 46% forest cover. So the difference in DC is about 11%. So one goal of this research, which I'm presenting to you today, was just to understand how common is this trend of tree inequality? How much does it vary from city to city? I'll show you some results from North Carolina. How much is that gap in tree cover between rich and poor neighborhoods? How is it explained by income? Is it explained by race and ethnicity? You know, what is driving these differences in patterns? And I'm also going to try to link, I'll show you some data linking tree cover to summer temperatures. So trees cool the air in a couple of ways. One is obvious and maybe one less so. Trees shade impervious surfaces, pavement, asphalt, and so those are not absorbing the sun's energy. That's maybe the obvious way trees cool things. The less obvious way sometimes to people is that trees transpire water as they're growing, and that cools off the air. So just like when you sweat on a hot day and it evaporates off your skin, you feel cooler. Trees, because they are shedding water, cool the air pretty significantly, and we'll get into that. And then what are the health implications? If the benefits trees provide are being supplied unequally, what does that mean for the health in low-income and high-income neighborhoods? And finally, we wanted to get at with this research, how many trees would it be required? Would you need to close that gap between rich and poor? So how big is this problem, and what might it cost to solve it? So these were our key questions. I'm going to show you now some of our results, and along the way, try to highlight a few statistics from North Carolina. Okay, so this was our study domain here. We looked at the 100 largest urbanized areas in the US. And an urbanized area is a term from the US Census Bureau. It's just sort of it's a consistent way to define metro regions. So the Raleigh area, the Raleigh metro region, right, would also include Cary and many other things that are politically different towns, but are part of that same commuting area. And so for each of these, we wanted to map tree cover in a consistent way. By the way, the picture in the lower left here is a zoomed in picture of tree cover in the Los Angeles region in this case. So there's a whole part of this story, which is a remote sensing story, and trying to use now the massive power of cloud computing to map tree cover consistently across what amounts to almost 6,000 municipalities, 158,000 square kilometers, about 40 billion pixels. So the power of this data, and then we did this using aerial photos that the US government takes every few years of the US through the National Agricultural Imagery Program. Those are now all available on the web through things like the Google Earth Engine platform. And you can use different algorithms to classify that. So if you know what's a tree and what's not tree, you can take all those aerial photos and make a map of what's a tree and what's not. So the power of this kind of classification is shown a little in these two pictures. So the upper left here is the whole New York City metro region from Manhattan all the way out to the Long Island, Connecticut. And then the lower right is a zoomed in picture of Central Park. And you can start to see individual tree canopies on trees in the Upper West Side in this case. So for all these communities now, we can see individual tree canopy, right, all the way out to these big patterns across the metro. Yeah. And this is kind of the kind of work that even 5 years ago, computationally, this would have been really hard. You would be trying to do all of this analysis on your own personal computer or some supercomputer. And now through the power of distributed computing, you can run algorithms like this, and the hard work is spread among thousands of computers around the globe. Okay, I'm going to jump to some high-level results and then get progressively more and more detailed. So what we found was this pattern of tree inequality is everywhere. We were surprised at how widespread it was. 92% of American communities have systematically more tree cover in high-income neighborhoods than in low-income neighborhoods. So we suspected that this, on average, would be the trend. There'd been studies in particular places like Baltimore and Boston that had shown this, but it's quite surprising to us that it was this widespread, that it's almost a universal trend that poor neighborhoods have less trees than rich neighborhoods. And similar magnitude of the trend in terms of race and ethnicity. So white neighborhoods, non-Hispanic white neighborhoods have tree cover that is greater than neighborhoods that are predominantly people of color. So how much bigger? Maybe that's the next question. How much more tree cover do rich neighborhoods have than poor neighborhoods? So there's a lot of information packed into this table. So just bear with me. Let's look at the bottom row here and the first column. So the first column is percent tree cover. And I'm showing on the left the low income. So 19.7% tree cover on average across all low income neighborhoods in the US. And versus for high income neighborhoods, 34.9% tree cover on average. So that's about a 15 percentage point difference in tree cover, which is pretty significant. We'll talk in a second about what that means for health. Now, as you go up above the bottom row, I've broken down US cities into different categories of population density. So why would you do that? Well, our cities in the US, and actually cities in most places, are structured in a really particular way, right? You have a dense core. So let's say you're in high density areas, above 8,000 people per square kilometer. That is multifamily apartment buildings mostly. And you can notice, actually, there's not much of a difference in percent tree cover in really dense neighborhoods. Let's say you go up to the moderate population density category, 4,000 to 8,000 people per square kilometer. That is the density of, say, townhouses or row houses. And you can see there starts to be a difference. High-income neighborhoods have a little bit more tree cover on average. By the time you get to low population density or very low, you are in the domain of single-family homes, on individual lots. Very low population density would be houses on very large lots. So you can see that this differential, this tree inequality, is actually more in the suburbs. That was a second surprise to us. We didn't really expect that. All right, I talked about the percent tree cover column here. There's two other columns, and I'll just describe what they are and why they're here, why they're important. So the middle category is the population that lives in each of these density categories. So why am I showing you this? Well, I want to talk through a pattern that is really common in US cities. Doesn't happen in every city. Manhattan is kind of an outlier, but it happens in most cities. So you can notice that high-income households live at very low to low population density. So our high-income households are in the suburbs, mostly. And because of that, they have more tree cover on average. If you start to look at low-income households, they tend to live in apartment buildings at higher population density. So in other words, part of the reason there's this tree inequality has to do with whether households are living in the suburbs or in the city center. Let's just look at the column on the right here. This is just the area. And this is in square kilometers. I'm sorry, I probably should have translated this into square miles. But what I want you to take out of this is just that the city center, even though they might have a lot of people in it, doesn't take up that much area. There's actually a lot of area that are in the suburbs. And I'll return to why that's important later when we talk about the magnitude of the tree gap and how many trees you would have to plant to equalize this and correct for this tree inequality. All right, I switched over to a line graph here. I hope people can see that. And this is just to give you a sense of the trends in a few variables across all of the quartiles of income. So again, the lowest quartile here is the poorest 25% of households, all the way up to Q4, that's the richest 25% of households. So the black line here is forest cover. So you can see as households get wealthier, they tend to have more forest cover. The green line here is population density. So that's the same trend I just showed you in tabular form. As you get richer, households tend to be more in the suburbs. They tend to be at lower density. The blue line here is data I haven't shown you before. This is the proportion of non-Hispanic white households in a neighborhood. And so you can see that by the time you get up to the third quartile, fourth quartile, most of those households are white, non-Hispanic white households. Whereas people of color tend to live at higher densities and they tend to have less tree cover. Interestingly, there's also a trend with age. So older people tend to live more in the suburbs. People are later on in their career, they've made more income, maybe they're at a different stage in their life. And so there's also an interesting trend here where young households, maybe people just starting to have kids, tend to live in the city center, tend to have less tree cover. Households that are older tend to live in the suburbs and have more tree cover. So many things relate to this gradient in income, which makes sometimes understanding causality, what's causing what, kind of challenging. All right, so now I'm going to show some maps, and I'm a geographer by training, a landscape ecologist by training, so I love maps. So I hope you'll bear with me. This map is just showing you the median or average tree cover in US metro areas, the 100 largest metro areas. And so things that are green have more tree cover. So you can see the Southeast has lots of tree cover. We're blessed with lots of tree cover in North Carolina and our cities. And then as you get, say, to the Southwest, there's much less tree cover. So that shouldn't be too surprising. It's a desert, right, in Phoenix, and it's not naturally forested. Any trees that occur in the arid Southwest were planted there. Whereas in the East, if you don't mow it, it will eventually become trees. So you can notice, though, that the Northeast, some of our denser industrial cities like New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, have less tree cover because it's denser, there's more pavement there. Okay, so I switched over to another map. This one is maybe a little more interesting. This is the difference in tree cover between rich and poor neighborhoods. So I'm taking the richest 25% of households and their tree cover and subtracting that number from the tree cover in the poorest 25% of households. So just to give you some context for North Carolina, Winston-Salem, the difference here is about 9.4%. Raleigh, it's 10.1%. Charlotte, it's 8.1%. So all in these shades of blue. We actually don't have a huge difference in tree cover in the Southeast. It's partially because all of our cities, both the suburbs and the city centers, tend to be relatively low density. So even in the center of Raleigh, for instance, houses often have a yard with trees above them. As you start to get in the purple colors here, there's much bigger difference between high-income neighborhoods and low-income neighborhoods. So look at the pattern for New York City, Boston, that whole Northeast corridor. So why is that? Well, these cities have really dense cores that were developed before the automobile. Think about Manhattan, right? And then they have suburbs that are very spread out. So think about, if anyone knows, like say Westchester County, north of New York City, very low density, in fact, and very wealthy suburbs. So the Northeast of the US in many ways has the biggest tree inequality because the inequality in land, land area that people own or live on is the most extreme. And you can see, finally, there's a few cities, this turquoise shade, where low-income households actually have more trees. This actually tends to occur in sort of cities in Oklahoma, Texas, that are quite low density, or interestingly, in places that are coastal communities where the rich households tend to be near the coast because it's a nice place to live. All right, so I showed you a lot of detail about tree inequality, this difference in tree cover between rich and poor neighborhoods. So why does it matter? Well, first and foremost, it matters because it affects temperature. And people don't realize it until there's a heat wave, but trees are a big way that we protect ourselves from the extremes that happen on a summer heat wave. In a typical year, heat waves are the biggest cause of mortality out of all of our weather events. So it far exceeds hurricanes and floodings. Typically, trees, some of my own research suggests trees probably save 1,200 lives a year. Meaning if all the trees in our cities disappeared, there'd be 1,200 extra people who died every year because of heat stress. A typical row of street trees might reduce summer temperatures by 2 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit just around that row of trees. So there's many other health benefits, as I showed you, from trees, and we could talk about mental health benefits, property values, etc. But I'm going to focus for the rest of my talk on this heat relationship because it has such a direct link to human health. So I showed you on average that in US cities, low-income blocks, low-income neighborhoods have 15% less tree cover. We also did a lot of work to measure surface temperature. So you can measure this with satellite imagery now. And this is the temperature if you touched pavement or grass. Low-income neighborhoods are on average 3 degrees Fahrenheit hotter across US cities. The differences are largest, though, in the Northeast. So Providence, Rhode Island, for instance, has the dubious distinction of having the biggest difference in surface temperature. There's a 10-degree Fahrenheit difference between rich and poor neighborhoods. And I listed a few others in the Northeast here. Bridgeport, Worcester, Philadelphia, Boston. In North Carolina, the difference in temperatures here is a little bit less. So I mentioned Winston-Salem has a 9.4% difference in tree cover. So that translates into about a 2-degree Fahrenheit difference in surface temperature. So that is, rich neighborhoods in Winston-Salem are about 2 degrees Fahrenheit cooler on average than poor households. So at first that might not sound like a lot when you're thinking about temperatures of 100 degrees Fahrenheit. What is an extra 2 degrees Fahrenheit? But we know from medical doctors that every degree Fahrenheit in a heat wave really matters. So the bottom bullet point here is showing you a study by a couple of medical doctors called Anderson and Bell. And they found that for every 1 degree Fahrenheit increase in air temperature, you have an increase of dying during a heat wave of 2.5%. So in other words, in Winston-Salem, all else being equal, poor neighborhoods probably have about, people living in poor neighborhoods have about a 5% greater chance of dying during a heat wave than people in high-income neighborhoods. And in a city like Providence, that difference might be 25%, right? So a 25% difference in mortality during a heat wave is a really significant and I would argue really unfair difference. So as we think about climate change, which is going to make heat waves more frequent and more intense, this kind of inequality in environmental risk and in tree cover is going to become increasingly an environmental justice issue, I think, that has a lot of currency in the US and that we're trying to fix. So how big is that problem? That's what this concept of the tree cover gap is trying to get at. Again, I gave you a table here which has lots of data, so just bear with me. We're going to go row by row here. First of all, the columns are the same population density categories I talked about before, from very low population density, which is the suburbs, individual houses on large lots, to high population density above 8,000 people per square kilometer. This is multifamily apartment buildings. And the right column is the total across all US cities. So you can see here that we would need, across all US cities, let's jump down to the third row here, about a little more than 1,200 square kilometers of new tree cover to close this gap between rich and poor neighborhoods. And much of that sits in the suburbs. So this was the point I was trying to make, that the suburbs just occupy a large area of US cities. And so to really equalize tree cover in suburban and exurban neighborhoods would require planting lots of trees. So we estimate that across all of these population density categories, you'd have to plant around 62.2 million trees to close this gap. That's the fourth row down here. Now, how much would it cost to plant those trees, and what are poor neighborhoods missing out on? So the very bottom row here is the cost of planting 62 million trees. It's about $17.6 billion. So that sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money. It's the kind of thing that as a society we'd have to invest in over a decade or more. The row above it, though, is called compensatory value. And this is to give you a sense of how much adult trees are really worth. So there's actually a legal way in the US that in a court proceeding, people talk about the value of trees. So let's say your neighbor backs his car into your tree in your yard and kills your tree. There's a defined way that you are compensated for that damage. And so this is a legal value that in the US we set to trees to talk about all the benefits they're providing to your household. So if you add it all up, rich households have about $56 billion more of compensatory value of trees than low-income households. So what this is trying to show you, the compensatory value row and the bottom row, is that even though it may cost a lot, 17-something billion dollars to close this gap, once those trees grow up, it's actually a bargain. We tend to get much more in economic value out of trees than we spend in planting them. It just takes them a few years to mature, but they're very good investment over the long term. So that's kind of the thing that motivates me to do this science or to give talks to folks like you, is to start inspiring scenes like the one you're seeing here on the screen. This is a tree planting in Louisville, Kentucky, but we've done them in almost all 50 states, I think. This is how you start planting those millions of trees I was talking about, is site by site, community by community, as city governments start to work to rectify this inequality, and as people demand more trees in their neighborhood, volunteer their time to plant trees or take care of them. So even though I presented this broad national picture for you, I hope you can think about your own community, your own street, and where street trees might fit into that landscape. Because really, we face a choice as we build those big new cities of the future. I showed you that picture of the Los Angeles River, or this much more green river in Seoul. that's the kind of choice we're facing. We're building the cities of the future now. We are reconstructing our neighborhoods now and deciding the kind of world that our kids are gonna inherit. And so as our communities start to think about climate change and heat waves getting more frequent and more intense, I think we have to think about this issue of tree inequality, and we have to think about how we can start to reconcile it, both for environmental justice reasons and just to make everyone's life in cities a little more green and a little more pleasant. So that's what motivated me to do this research and motivates me to talk today. And I think I'll stop there and I'll take any questions that folks have.
All right, everybody. Let's give Rob a great big round of applause. Wherever you're at, you can put your hands together. I'm sure he'll hear it all the way over in Switzerland. Or, of course, you can drop like some clapping hands emojis into the chat box to leave your appreciations. Excellent presentation. Very interesting and thought-provoking to think about how across the country this story of trees is played out in the process of developing all over really. And we've got some great questions coming up in the chat too. Let me see if I can't get some of these pulled up. So, okay. Are you ready for questions?
Sure.
Let's do it. Robin Moore writes, any data specifically on street trees, which could be a green justice equalizer? All neighborhoods have public domain streets. Thanks for the very useful presentation.
Yeah, that's a great question. And part of the reason that denser neighborhoods, you see less of a difference in tree cover between rich and poor neighborhoods is in our city centers, most of the greenery is on the public right-of-way. And so there has been an attempt in many municipalities to be a little just and to try to equalize. Doesn't mean every municipality succeeds. Whereas at lower densities, a lot of the difference in tree cover has to do with what's happening in people's yards and trees on the private domain. So I wish I had the specific factoid of just tree cover difference on the public right-of-way. It turns out there's no US-wide map of what is public land versus private land. It's challenging. But certainly for certain cities, we know how to do that. So I could try to look up that difference. But I would expect that there still is a trend for rich neighborhoods to have more tree cover on the public right-of-way, but it's less extreme than the overall tree inequality I'm showing.
Okay, interesting insight. The folks from the North Carolina Aquarium on Roanoke Island who are watching want to know if tree cover space needed to close the gap looked at trees grown on top of buildings.
No, it didn't. So there's also a way that you could imagine green roofs or trees that are overhanging buildings, even allowing for even more greenery in cities than what I'm showing here. But it's a good technical point. We were kind of just looking at the footprint of areas in cities that were not paved, that weren't buildings or paved.
I wonder how many buildings have trees on them to begin with. Seems like
tree cover is
bars and
tree cover is rare on buildings, but there's many more buildings that are starting to use green roofs, which we weren't studying here. That's more kind of grasses and shrubs, but that can be a really important way that buildings reduce their heating and cooling bills and provide a little more green for residents of the building to go out and enjoy. I don't know if Raleigh, places like that has a lot of green roofs, but it's definitely more and more common. And you see cities starting to have incentives to encourage it. So in Chicago, for instance, I know that the way they've set up their building codes now, if a building has a green roof, it can be a little bit taller. So if you're a developer, it's worth putting in the green roof because you can put on another story on the building and add a few more apartments, for instance.
Oh, okay. Incentivizing some eco-friendly solutions. All right, let's see. Karen writes that it seems like there's a real risk that planners might look at this and think, oh, we should have more single family housing with tree filled yards. But then that leads to sprawl. So, how do you balance the preservation of green space around cities with increasing density in the urban core and still increase urban tree cover?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And actually, inspired by this research, we started a new project now we're calling Denser and Greener for All, which what we're doing is looking at US neighborhoods that are, we call them bright spots. So neighborhoods that are both dense and green, and trying to understand how they got there. So I sort of showed you the average trend, but there's a lot of variation. So there are neighborhoods that are both dense but have a lot of parks for people and have a lot of trees. And so what we're trying to understand are what are best practices that allow you to do that. And some of them are pretty straightforward. It's about having abundant street trees down the public right of way. It's also about limiting parking lots when you can, or using underground parking lots so that you can use the surface space that isn't covered by buildings to have some space for trees or for parks. So I agree with you. I don't think planners should not take this as an incentive to push for more single family homes. It's more like an incentive to be thoughtful when you're planning new neighborhoods about how you're making sure everybody has some tree cover nearby. And there are ways to be both dense and green.
Excellent. All right. Let's see. Michael James from Keep Durham Beautiful writes, have you used the Milwaukee method of growing small forests in urban areas? Are you familiar with this?
So I don't know that. Yeah, I don't know that particular method.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, we certainly partner with a lot of cities and urban foresters on planting trees in cities, and the general philosophy is sometimes talked about as right tree, right place. So you want to make sure you have a species that's good for that climate, but also for that site. So if it's a wet site, maybe plant a red maple, something like that. And then if it's a very urban site, people plant ginkgos. It's not a native tree species from China, but it's super hardy to areas that are almost 100% pavement. So when you're in a Manhattan or something, you'll see a row of ginkgos, and they're quite beautiful in the fall, even if they're not a native tree. So that people, if you want to Google right tree, right place, there's a whole set of guidelines of how you could pick trees that are appropriate for your yards. But I wish I knew more about that specific technique. I'm sorry to dodge it. I have to go Google that.
Sure thing. No, we'll learn something new too. A couple of related questions came in, one from Becca and then one from a student at Governor Moorhead School in Raleigh. Does the type of tree matter, like oak or conifer? And then the student wanted to know, does it change the money value depending on the type of tree?
So yeah, the type of tree matters for several things. So it depends on which of the benefits of trees you're talking about. I of course care about the biodiversity value of trees. So planting oaks, for instance, in North Carolina or in DC is great for biodiversity. It's a species or genera that supports a lot of biodiversity, right? So there are reasons to plant species that are native to support biodiversity better. I talked for part of this talk about heat, and what matters there for heat reduction is basically how much shade you're casting, how big the leaf area is. So there is a sense in which deciduous trees, broadleaf trees, tend to cast a little more shade than conifers. But of course, there's also this seasonal difference. So sometimes people will recommend, for instance, planting deciduous trees on the south side of your house because it's consistently sunny, gets hot in the summer. But sometimes people recommend planting, the other way around, conifer trees on the south side. So they're always casting shade, but then deciduous trees on the north side of your house so that in the winter, you want to let some sunlight in, maybe from your north side, but then in the summer, you want that shade. So there are distinctions about what tree you want to plant depending on the benefit you're trying to get from these trees.
So folks, get in touch with somebody who knows a little bit about some sustainable landscaping, maybe, when it comes to especially big plantings like this. Go for those eco-friendly landscape designers. All right, let's see. Looking at the clock and the questions that remain, I'm going to throw one more at you. Again, from students at the Governor Moorhead School. Where can students get funding to plant trees in their communities? And how do they get permits and permissions to do that if they want to plant trees?
So, yeah, I would recommend that you reach out to either the parks agency in your town, the urban forestry agency in your town, or the USDA extension office can usually help you find a good source. What's complicated in the US is it tends to vary city by city, but in most cities, there is a nonprofit group that is the sort of advocates for trees. You could also reach out to, I guess, the Arbor Day Foundation as a national group. And so in each city, then that local group will know good sources of trees and often sources of free or low-cost trees. So in Washington, DC, where I lived for many years, there's a group called Casey Trees. Casey Trees gets basically free trees from the city. And if you call them up, they'll come and help you plant them. If you're planting on your own property, you don't usually need a permit unless there's issues about underground permits, underground cables and stuff. So just be careful of that. Planting in the public right away is different. You do need permission from the city, obviously. So don't do that. But it's certainly appropriate to call up your city officials or shoot them an email and say, hey, my street doesn't have any trees in the public right away. I wish I had more. Many cities, in fact, basically prioritize tree planting based on who complains. So it's worth complaining if you want some more trees.
There you go. There's a strategy that just might work. Well, Rob, thanks so much for being a part of the Lunchtime Discovery Series today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. It was a pleasure.
It was great to learn about the research and some of the work that the Nature Conservancy is doing as well. Folks, thanks for tuning in to this edition as well. Glad that you all were here with us. Make sure you check out eenorthcarolina.org and naturalsciences.org for more upcoming events just like this one. And I hope that I'll see you again on another edition of this weekly lecture series. Until then, take care, stay safe, keep your community safe, and we'll see you again next time. Bye, everybody.